Hey, I want to do a quick shout out to Workforce Solutions Capital Area for helping host this event right here. Go ahead and give it a click there, David. Um, just so y'all know, Workforce Solutions, if you are having trouble recruiting and hiring people right now, Workforce Solutions is kind of my go-to place for starting the ball rolling and being able to find people, but also finding more information out about, hey, what's going on right now? I like to joke that hiring in 2022 is kind of scary, and who knows what it's going to be like in 2023, but they can oftentimes be a really valuable partner for you. Later on in the presentation, we're going to be talking a little bit more about some of the different upcoming events that you might be able to participate in as well, especially if you are excited about hiring people with disabilities. Speaking of which, the topic of the conversation today is hiring people with disabilities and the business use case. Next slide, please. So running quickly through the agenda and what we're going to be talking about today. First off, we're going to be doing introductions. Second off, we'll be talking about what actually is a disability and what qualifies. Third, we're going to talk about why this matters. Why does this matter for everybody for that matter? Next, we're going to be talking a little bit more and focusing specifically on Accenture and Walgreens study. Don't worry, I do have links for everything that I can share with y'all. So if you want to do further research on your own, you can. And the primary kind of advantages from a business use standpoint that we're going to be looking at are one, reduced turnover. We're going to be looking at profitability that are available for companies. And finally, we're going to be talking about access to an untapped labor pool. Towards the end here, I'm going to be giving you my advice for what you as an organization can do for next steps for hiring somebody with a disability and taking advantage of these things. And finally, I do like to make sure that I include all the resources for y'all for you to do your own research. But here's the other thing too, is that my job here at Peak Performers is to be a resource bank for you. So if you'd ever have questions, if you ever need access to resources, feel free to reach out to me and I'm happy to do what I can to help and at least get you pointed in the right direction as well. Next slide, please. Speaking of introductions, my name is Myles, and I've worked for Peak Performers for about 5 years. My title is Strategic Partnership Specialist, and basically what that means is that I am here to be a resource for both the business community, but also for job seekers as well. And I go out in the community and basically kind of make people aware that Peak Performers exists and talk a little bit more about what it means to hire somebody with a disability and talk with job seekers themselves who have disabilities and discuss with them what they want to do for their employment potential. It's something that I'm really passionate about, something that I've been doing personally for 5 years. And I would actually self-disclose that I'm a person with a disability. When you meet me in person, I'm actually wearing a pair of hearing aids, and that's how I'm going to be interacting with you. I have a severe high frequency hearing loss, and I've had it basically since I was about 1 year old. So basically my whole life for as long as I can remember. That said, I work with a large number of people, both within Peak as well as temporary associates, as well as just people in the community that experience a wide variety of different disabilities. And I would say too that I'm not the expert on all of those disabilities. I can oftentimes tell you some cursory information and get you pointed in the right direction and get you connected to the resources. But the really interesting thing about when you study disability is that it really is such a diverse topic that includes so many different people from so many different walks of life, and everything on disability, like autism, as you may have heard, exists on a spectrum. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. Next slide, please. So real quick, here's who Peak Performers is. We've been in business for about 27 years, going on 28 now. And last year we put about 1,400 people to work. From a business perspective, we did about $39 million annually in net revenue last year. Our core business is primarily serving office and professional roles. So a lot of administrative, a lot of accounting, a lot of finance, a lot of engineering and IT, scientific, all those kinds of things. A lot of our core business has been with government agencies, but we are a national staffing agency that services many, many different states across the entire United States and many customers, both large and small, with a variety of different positions. However, I would point out too that we are not always the best resource when it comes to finding somebody that's going to do janitorial staffing or warehouse staffing. We tend to focus a little bit more of our efforts specifically in kind of the office and professional space. But you name it, we've looked for it, including things like an epidemiologist last year. We've looked for ombudsmen. We've looked for all kinds of very unusual and niche jobs. And as a nonprofit, here's what we do is we believe in the innate ability of all people. We believe that too often people with disabilities have been identified first for their disability and second off for their innate abilities. And so we're trying to change that. We look at our work as changing the world one job at a time. And of those 1,400 people last year, about 85% of them had a disability. And the other kind of cool thing too is that we're helping so many employers right now unlock their full potential of hiring and finding great talent that does have disabilities as well. So we're really excited about that. And, it also has another kind of tangential benefit too. So much of us are really focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion right now. And what this allows us to do is this oftentimes allows us to plug into those existing DE&I initiatives and really help companies expand to their full potential with the disability element, as well as many other diverse elements as well. Next slide, please. All right, so let's talk about what a disability is. So a disability, a lot of times when we hear the word disability, we automatically assume that it's going to be somebody that's in a wheelchair or missing an arm or somebody that's blind or somebody that, is deaf. But actually disability exists on a spectrum and it affects many, many different people. Go ahead and click again, please. So a disability is anything physical, mental, or emotional that affects one or more major life functions. So major life function that could be sleeping, or that could be eating, or that could be moving around in the world. Think any, or even thinking or about how you process information cognitively. So a disability really does affect all kind of major aspects of our lives and how we interact with the world. Click again, please. Now, I would point out too that we also include the full scope of the Americans with Disabilities Act. This is something that's a pretty dynamic and pretty broad range of different conditions, and that includes things like ADHD and dyslexia and PTSD and sleep apnea and hypertension and depression. And I could go on and on. I myself am talking to you through a pair of hearing aids with my hearing loss right here. And if you talk to any individual person that might be on the call, or if you have any coworkers or anything like that that experience these issues themselves, they would be the first ones to tell you how much one of these conditions can affect not only sometimes them getting a job, but sometimes them keeping a job too. Of course, all individuals exist on a spectrum. So some people, for example, with autism, they might be very high function, quote unquote, high functioning and able to do a variety of like information technology kinds of tasks. And you might have people that exist on the autism spectrum and they might be more suited for like manual labor kinds of jobs or like warehouse kinds of jobs or very repetitive kinds of motion. And you'll find this with pretty much any one of these conditions right here. My particular hearing loss, I actually consider myself pretty fortunate because most of human speaking exists in the mid-range. So my own is a kind of on a spectrum right here. But also what's important to remember is that for each of these individual people, it might change based off of the day. So ask somebody that experiences depression or anxiety disorder, hey, what is it like for when things are getting a little bit worse for you? And they can tell you that oftentimes no 2 days are the same. And sometimes it's not necessarily about curing the condition. We're not curing the condition, we're managing the condition. And that's why it's so important for us as employers to make sure that we are recognizing these people and helping them and recognizing that they're managing this stuff and oftentimes doing a great job of it. Go ahead and click again. Now, I would point out too that the Center for Disease Control and Prevention estimates that 26% of Americans have a disability of some kind. And you are not misreading that. That is 1 in 4 Americans of quote unquote prime age working population, that's between the ages of 25 and 65, have a disability of some kind. And By most measures, that's probably an undercount because those are only the people that self-disclose. Speaking of self-disclosure, many of the people that come from a corporate environment have a lot of questions around self-disclosure. So we see the number 26%, but if you feel free to drop in the chat if you have a guess right here, but generally, what most people say is that the actual number of people that self-disclose in a corporate environment is around 3 or 4%. So not a whole lot at all. And we're going to talk about that discrepancy a little bit more too. Next slide, please. So why does this matter? Well, first off, people with with disabilities experience an unemployment rate that is double that of the national average, ×2. And again, this number is probably an undercount because a lot of people, especially if they have been shut out of the workforce for many, many years, they oftentimes give up and stop looking. And so they're no longer officially counted as part of the unemployment. Oftentimes, when times gets tough, they're the first ones to be let go and the last ones to be rehired. The other reason that I would point out that this matters is that disability is diversity. So it's estimated that 90% of all companies have a DE&I statement. However, only 4% of them actually include disability in there. Well, here's the thing, is that when you look at disability, it affects people of all races, all classes, all cultures. It affects all groups of people equally. It is the great equalizer. In fact, when Peak Performers goes and looks at our own metrics, we find that around 68% of all of our workforce are women, 60% self-identify as racially or ethnically diverse. And we see a whole host of other various different diversifying factors, such as 10% of our workforce are veterans. So the really cool thing about this is that when you recruit for something like disability, you actually get a better cross-section of all the people that are available to work. And here's the other thing too, is that it could be you or at least future you. So to tell you all a story, I was running earlier this week. I just started back up running for the year, and I was going through an intersection, and there was a car that I thought was going to stop, and they did not. And they came within 2 inches of, and they turned immediately in front of me while I was in the crosswalk. So I became 2 inches away from acquiring another motor disability, you know, and maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, but the reality of it is that the longer that we live, the more likely it is that we are going to acquire a disability. And sometimes it's not as obvious as that. Maybe you yourself might experience post-traumatic stress disorder from adverse life events. Or maybe yourself, you might develop situations of like hypertension or diabetes. You could develop any number of these things. In fact, the official estimates count at 26%, but by the time that you get to the age of 60, it's more around 30 to 35% of people that self-disclose as having a disability. So when you look out for a workforce that includes everybody, including people with disabilities, you are also looking out for yourself, but also you're looking out for the people that you love, because everybody around you is aging as well. Everybody around you is experiencing life, and accidents happen, things happen, life events happen that could basically turn any one of us into quote unquote disabled. I don't particularly like that word. I prefer the term people with disabilities myself, just because it puts the person first, but that's kind of the reality of it too. And today, we're going to be talking a little bit more about the business use case. So why should you as a business care about this? Now, I'm going to point out the very obvious thing. I feel like I have a pretty friendly group of people right here, but why should we care about hiring people with disabilities? It's the human thing to do. It is the human thing to do. And so much of this argument is really based around kind of numbers and cents, dollars and cents, if you will. But it's also the human thing to do. Really, we need to look out for each other. We need to look out for ourselves. We need to look out for a workplace that promotes equity and promotes really a culture where everybody feels that they can contribute in the workplace. But since I got you in here for the business use case, let's talk about that. Next slide, please. Alrighty. So feel free to drop in the chat. According to SHRM, how much do you think the average cost per hire is? Would anybody like to venture a guess here? Nobody has any guesses, huh? Alrighty, guys. Maybe you're just a little bit shy today. Don't worry. I'm usually pretty interactive, but that's okay. So the according to SHRM, the average cost per hire, go ahead and click for me, is $4,425. So that's a lot of money that costs for every single person that you hire. And when we take into this number into account, we're really looking at the full scope of everything that's involved. So how much does it cost you to advertise the job? How much does it pay you in hours to pay a recruiter to go and find that person? How much does it cost for you to train that person? So according to everything, and this is cross spectrum across all of society, for everything from a cashier all the way to an IT enterprise architect to an executive director for an organization, cost per hire is $4,425. And let me tell you, that adds up pretty quick. Next slide, please. So the first study that we're going to be looking at is we're going to be looking at the Walgreens study. So the Walgreens study was really unique because what they did is they actually looked at 10,000 employees working across their distribution centers. So within this 10,000 employee unit, 37% of them had a disability of some kind. And this was actually over 21 US distribution centers, basically across the entire United States. So what's cool about this is that we know it's not a one-off. We know that this is not an isolated incident, and we know that this is not a small subsection of the people, because if we do the math, hey, that's pretty easy. That means that we're looking at 3,700 people with disabilities to kind of draw and extrapolate this information in. The cool other thing that I would point out too with this Walgreens study is that the company was prepared to stop the program if they found that it just wasn't working out, but they actually found that it was a business imperative to keep going. Basically, they looked at the numbers, they looked at kind of what was happening behind the scenes, and they looked at how much of an impact they were having. And they're like, hey, this makes more business sense for us to actually keep going. And the other thing that I would like to point out too is that they debunked many different myths that go into hiring people with disabilities. So, including like, hey, how much does it actually cost to accommodate a person? Many employers that I talk to be completely honest with you, assume that it's going to be hundreds or thousands of dollars. They just kind of assume that, but the reality of it is that most of the people working for peak performers, for example, actually don't request an accommodation because they've already figured out what they need to be successful. And the biggest thing we can do is keep an open ear and keep the door open for them in case they do request something in the future. That said, people do request accommodations, and sometimes it is more work for the organization, but a lot of times that comes at very little to no cost. I like to tell the story that we previously had a individual that worked for us that was an epileptic, and he was going into the office place and he was experiencing really bad basically what was kind of preceding a seizure for him from the flickering of the fluorescent lights in his workplace. And so our accommodation was to basically talk with him and then talk with the hiring manager and say, hey, is it okay if he wears sunglasses in the workplace? Guess what? That came at absolutely no accommodation cost at all. And by far the most common accommodation request that we get as a company, by far and away, is requests for time off and schedule flexibility, because hey, you need to be able to take time. Again, we're managing our condition, we're not overcoming it, we're not curing our condition. You are managing your condition, and management takes time. So a lot of times that is simply having the time to go away and go to your doctor's appointment or take a mental health day if you are having a bad one. And the other thing that I would point out too is that they also debunked the myth about safety incidents. So in this particular study, Walgreens was looking at a lot of people that were actually driving forklifts. And what they found is that they actually found the opposite to be true of what they expected. They had people with disabilities experience 54% less incidents in the workplace. Additionally, they experienced 70% less workers' compensation claims in terms of just dollars and cents. So again, this is not like a direct, business use case as far as like, hey, I can't put it on a spreadsheet, but those are some pretty significant numbers right there, just talking about it. And I've been puzzling with that for the last couple of weeks as I've thought about it. And I almost think about it that maybe since these people, these folks with disabilities, were aware that they had some disadvantages going into it, say, for example, motor advantages or hearing disadvantages, which I know was a common thing that they recruited for within the Walgreens study. Maybe they were just a little bit more aware and a little bit more careful during the workday as well. Again, I'm just speculating, but that would be my reflection on that. Next slide, please, David. And then we're going to be looking at the Accenture study as well. So with the Accenture was a little bit different. And what they did is they basically compared companies and those specifically with a strong DE&I incentive and focused on hiring people with disabilities as compared with people without. There's one other study that I point to as well, commissioned by the Mental Health Commission of Canada, where they basically did a breakdown of many different companies of various different sizes, and they looked at each of those to see and compare with them, hey, what is the actual cost versus benefit for each of these? Accenture also points out that the really kind of debunking the myth of accommodation. So they said that 59% of disability accommodations cost nothing. Great. And then finally, they really talked about the tangential benefits as well. So they found an increase in innovation. They found improved shareholder benefits, improved productivity, improved market share, and enhanced reputation. All good things. Next slide, please. And so let's talk about that. So the first thing that I would point out is that when it comes to hiring people with disabilities, this was from the Walgreens study. They actually found that turnover was 48% less. This is a huge number, and we at Peak Performers experience similar kinds of rates as well. We actually have a turnover rate that is half that of the national staffing average. And there's a lot of reasons that we could speculate as to why. Perhaps maybe they need this job more, or perhaps they feel perhaps they feel more loyal to us as an employer because we were taking care of them. I'm not sure. I'm not 100% sure, but what we do experience is that we do experience significantly less turnover. And when we go back to the SHRM study that looks at $4,425 per hire, that means that 48% is going to add up pretty darn quickly. Next slide, please. This is actually looking at the Accenture study, and this is talking about profitability within companies. So what they overall found is that when it comes to revenue, they were 28 companies that were champions of disability hiring and disability inclusion within their workplace had 28% higher revenue. Additionally, from an income perspective, they had about double that of the income. And then finally, just pure economic profit margin, the champions experienced 30% more. There was a couple of other things too that were noted as tangential benefits from this particular study. In particular, Accenture points out an increase in innovation. They found increased productivity from their workforce as a whole. They also found enhanced reputation, which is pretty significant. If you talk with any large corporate leader, it's all about innovation. And the whole reason that we're doing the whole DE&I thing, obviously it's the human thing to do, but the second thing that's often listed is we want to make sure that we continue to innovate. We want to make sure that we're continuing to bring in new ideas and new talent. And guess what? People with disabilities, they are not only consumers, they're not only workers, they're all parts of society. And so the more that you can include them within your organization to help drive not only these numerical changes, but also these innovation and idea changes, the more that they're going to be able to appeal to your customers. It adds up. It adds up. Next slide, please. And then finally, this is really kind of Peak Performer specialty, is access to a largely untapped labor pool, and or helping to really realize the potential of the people that you already have working for you who have disabilities. And I want to take a second to kind of pause on each of these pictures. Right here in the upper left, we see a gentleman who is using a wheelchair. And in the upper right, we see a gentleman, and he's bearing a sign that says, "Homeless vet, need help, God bless you." So oftentimes these first two images are the first things that we as a society oftentimes will associate with people with disabilities, unfortunately. And these people need help. To be honest with you, there are a wide range of different people on the spectrum that have disabilities disabilities, some of whom are going to need access to very basic services, and they're going to need access to food, they're going to need access to money, and some of them are going to need access to government services as well. Yes, absolutely. But I would also point out too that there are an estimated 10.9 million people out there from all levels within your organization. So we're talking about people that are doing customer service, they're doing admin, they're doing contract management, there are people that are working on your warehouse floor, all the way up to the C-suite as well. In fact, one of the biggest challenges that corporate America is facing right now is that I often joke that you can't delegate disability inclusion. I mean, you can try, but it sure helps if you as a leader are able to stand in front and say, guess what? I myself have a disability. So it affects so many people from so many different walks of life. And really, what you're doing is that when you or making it so that your organization is more open to all people, including those with disabilities, you are going to make it so that not only are they more likely to apply in the first place, but also more likely that they're going to stick around and get promoted within your workplace and feel comfortable with there. And maybe you too are going to experience a turnover rate that is about half that of the average. Next slide, please. So let's talk about next steps. I'm all about kind of talking about, hey, what are the things that I can do right now to have a positive impact? The first thing that I would do is that you need to set specific measurable goals, and you need to include disability hiring in your DE&I statement. Again, 90% of companies have a DE&I statement, but only 4%, that's 1, 2, 3, 4% actually include disability specifically called out there. And anybody in the DE&I space will tell you how important it is to specifically call out as a way to be as inclusive as possible and try to make it explicit exactly how much you want to include people. I would also talk to your recruiting team and seek to recruit people from specific talent pools. For peak performers perspective, we have to work hard at it. Like we have to go and specifically find people that might not be as visible as everybody that's just hanging out on Indeed or everybody that's hanging out on LinkedIn. Keep in mind, sometimes these people have experienced significant periods of job loss or employment gap. And sometimes it's a matter of not only going and finding them in the first place, but then also being able to give them a shot or, be able to look past any things that might be traditionally seen as red flags on their resume and consider them anyway and get them to the next steps and at least give them the shot, give them that opportunity. And I always tell people that it really does matter about hiring your first person with a disability. It is not good enough to talk a big game. It's not enough to have lots of really, really good information on your website. It all comes down to who you hire. I am very fortunate that I get to be the thought leader for a lot of peak performers, but the reality of it is that I am backed up by 30 plus people whose jobs every single day is to match one person and get that person a butt in a seat, as I call it, or basically a person a job. I do encourage that you really focus on a culture of self-disclosure. Why should I bother with self-disclosure? Well, it's not something that you can delegate. It's not something that, hey, I'd like for everybody else to come forward and just tell me about the disabilities that you're having. No, if you talk about self-disclosure, again, 3 to 4% of people actually come out and self-disclose in the workplace. And a lot of times they're doing so because they have something that you can't ignore, like they are actually physically using a wheelchair. But a lot of times that is still excluding many people that maybe are experiencing invisible disabilities as well. So I'd encourage you, start with a culture of self-disclosure. Think to yourself, hey, would I feel comfortable myself disclosing to my company and disclosing to my peers and disclosing to my coworkers? And I would also kind of venture to say, what would you be able to share with them to say, here's why I've been successful, here's what I need to continue being successful, and here are my challenges, here are my struggles. Look, we're all humans here. So what are your challenges and what are your struggles, and how can you really kind of not only share with those with the team because you're not invincible, but also use that as a learning opportunity so that everybody can share their own challenges and own struggles as well. And the final bit is that I would encourage a culture of normalizing and embracing accommodations and accessibility. When it comes to accommodations, again, most of the time it comes at little to no cost. When it does come at a cost, it is usually for the benefit of the whole organization. The example that I would point out too is that originally sidewalks were not designed with any kind of ramps to them at all. And it took significant pushback from the disability community to say, hey, we need a ramp to be able to get onto the sidewalk so we can move our wheelchairs up onto it. So what I would think about is I would really think about the fact that when you did this, when you all of a sudden made a policy for the whole of the United States to have accessible sidewalks, all of a sudden, families that are pushing baby carriages are able to get up onto the sidewalk easier. Or maybe if you have let's say you're working with a grocery cart or something like that. When was the last time that you had to push a grocery cart up onto the sidewalk as well? All of these basically make it so that you can access this particular feature. In fact, the iPhones and smartphones of today were originally designed for people with disabilities. So the more that we can do to really kind of embrace accommodations and realize that it is for the benefit of all of us, or it might even be for the benefit of future us, the more we can really be successful in that way. And when it comes to accessibility, by the way, I did see your comment here real quick, Gene. So give me just a second, and I'll tackle that. Um, when it comes to accessibility, we talk a lot about accessibility of web platforms, and we talk about accessibility of our websites and of all of our backend systems and our data and things like that. So just to give you an example, I work in the field of search engine optimization, which is a really nerdy way of saying that I make it easier for Google to be able to find us and see us and understand what we're talking about. So one of the best practices that we are able to use from a search engine optimization perspective, could you back up one step there, David? Sorry. One of the best practices is really just focusing on how can I be as accessible of a website as possible, and then actually makes me perform better on the Google search results. By the way, we did have one comment that I'm going to address. Thank you for the question, Gene. And Gene asked, what is a DE&I statement? Good question. So a DE&I statement is a diversity, equity, and inclusion statement. So diversity, just to kind of tackle that real quick, diversity is basically talking from an organization about, hey, what does it mean to have many different types of people working here within the organization? And that includes racial minorities, or this includes ethnic minorities, or perhaps people that are older and younger, or basically whenever you read a statement at the bottom of the job description saying we do not discriminate, that's what it's talking about. But it also is talking about the whole host of different diverse elements that we have going through our entire life. When it comes to equity, that's basically talking about how can we not only be equal in the workplace, but also how can we really make sure that we are distributing resources and attention to the people in our organization that need them most. And finally, the I of that part of that is inclusion. And that's talking about how can we make sure that as an organization, we are as inclusive as possible so that, I don't get a job and then feel completely isolated. How can we be as inclusive as possible to all the people within the organization and be one cohesive environment? So hopefully that helps out there, Gene. Thanks for your question on what is a DE&I statement. The final bit that I would have as well is that you're not in this alone. I'm going to drop my contact information into the chat, and I would encourage you to reach out to me. But also Peak Performers as a whole is an organization that is here to support. Obviously, if you need help with hiring somebody, great. We're happy to chat with you. We're happy to talk with you and talk with you about how you can hire professionals with disabilities within your organization. So I encourage you to reach out to me. But if you just need other elements too, if you have questions for me, or if you are experiencing a particular challenge within your workplace, reach out to me. I am happy to help. And before I forget, I am going to drop my, David, would you allow me to be able to share everything with everyone? or maybe if you're able to include that here, I'll go ahead and just pop it in there. And if you wouldn't mind being able to share that with everybody, David, thank you. So again, I'm here to be a resource for y'all. It's something that I personally believe very passionately in, as well as all the people within our organization. So I'd encourage you to reach out to us. I'm going to leave it open real quick. I finished a little bit ahead of time, but that's okay. I would love to hear what questions that y'all have, or what specific challenges that you have, or hey, maybe something that you'd like to challenge me on too. I am always welcome to that. Does anybody have questions or comments? Alrighty, it's pretty quiet there. Nobody has any questions at all? I promise I
Myles, can you hear me okay?
can hear you, Gene. What's up?
Well, I wasn't really sure what this program was going to be about when I signed up for it, but I did want to provide some input that I think is really important to provide,
Please do.
to structure some jobs with flexible hours, and particularly part-time work, and perhaps even work, say 2, 3, 4 days a week rather than 5 days a week. But flexibility, I think, is really key for some folks with disabilities.
Absolutely. I think time flexibility is incredibly important. I think the other thing that most employers may be overlooking is the really, really big value of ability to work from home or work remotely, especially under certain circumstances too. For example, it's the really cool thing about this is, again, it comes at very little to no cost to you as an employer. But what it allows you to do is it really allows you to open the gates to people that might have trouble getting into your office, or might have trouble getting the perfect setup, but that they have the perfect setup at home. Let me be clear that many people with disabilities want to work in your office, they want to be integrated, and they want to be working around you. But it can be a low-hanging fruit that you can grasp to help open the doors to more people with disabilities. But as Gene said, yes, time flexibility is a huge one, and also part-time stuff too. If you are able to provide part-time work as well, a lot of times people with disabilities, especially if they are in the middle of managing a flare-up, or if they are in the process of undergoing pretty intensive treatment or care, or if they just have to spend a significant amount of their time managing their disability, this can be really huge for them to be able to be self-sufficient. So thank you, Gene. I really appreciate that comment.
You bet.
And then Lamisa says, from a recruiter view, what lingo and conversations are you having to get them to disclose any disability? Well, that's a good question. By the way, it's good to see you on here. I'm so glad that we had a chance to connect a couple weeks back. So generally, what I do is with every single person I'm talked to, I say, hey, by the way, so I'm going to tell you a little bit more about who Peak Performers and what Peak Performers does. We're a nonprofit staffing and recruiting agency that helps professionals with disabilities find jobs and advance their careers. Now, as a disability, it may include something visible and obvious about a person, or it may include an invisible condition too. And then usually what I do is I specifically list individual conditions that people will experience that are fairly common, or that a lot of people may have, or that they know somebody else that has. And generally just the process of specifically listing those conditions gets people to think about it a little bit more, and gets people to say, well, what about this? Or what about this aspect? You can also include things that might be like any chronic medical condition. Now, the tricky part about it is that the Americans with Disabilities Act does not specifically list any disabilities. They actually keep it broad and open-ended, just so that it can be as inclusive to many different people as possible that are experiencing many different situations in life. But generally, the guidance that I give to people is anything that ain't going away. It is a condition that is here with you forever. My hearing loss is not going to improve. I can stick hearing aids in to manage them, but that does not mean that my hearing is going to get any better. And then let me say, it's all about really trying to break it down and trying to have a conversation with an individual and to gain their trust, because that's what it's all about. Disability is very weird for a lot of people. A lot of people have many feelings about it where they feel like they are inadequate or they feel like they may be subjected to prejudice in the workplace, or they may be feeling like, hey, I manage my disability, so therefore it's not a disability. I can't tell you how often I hear people tell me that I'm not disabled enough to qualify for your services. So the reality of it is breaking it down, explaining what a disability is, explaining how inclusive as it is, listing some specific examples, and then encouraging them to self-disclose as well as give them additional information. So for our part, we usually refer them onto a list of of many more disabilities and encourage them to do some of their own research. That way they can think about it a little bit more. But the other part too, for anybody that might be in here that is questioning, how do I do it? It's one person at a time. This is not, and this, so this conversation is going to happen with one recruiter and one hiring manager at a time, and then it's going to happen with one individual job seeker that you have at a time. There is no quick wins here. You can have some good policy decisions. You can have some good guidance for your organization, but this happens one person at a time. So really, it's not like flicking a light switch. It's more about a movement, not a moment. Any other questions that y'all have?
Miles, do you prepare people for interviews?
Good question. So when it comes to interviews, yes, we do some kind of coaching with the candidates typically, just to make sure that they are prepared for a particular interview. When it comes to interviewing with peak performers, I like to say that it's the least scary interview that you'll ever do, because we are trying to screen you in, not trying to screen you out. And really, I think that that's pretty valuable insight for all recruiters or hiring managers that are on the call right now. Look, we're in a hiring crisis right now. We are in a hiring crunch. So what can you do to screen people in as opposed to screen people out? But going back to Gene's question there and talking about, hey, how can we prepare people for an interview? Keep in mind that historically, a lot of times the most charismatic people have oftentimes gotten the job, but they're not necessarily the people that are most qualified to do the job. So I would encourage you, if you're a recruiter, how can I think about coaching or providing feedback or really kind of guiding people towards the interview process so that they're going to be successful? And Gene, yes, we do some of that. We like to make sure that people are set up for success with our organization. Any other
Well,
questions?
the reason I ask is I'm a wheelchair user. And if I'm applying for a job and I know perhaps there's some travel involved, um, perhaps one of the first things I would say is, I understand this job involves traveling and duties A, B, and C. Here's how I would address that. And I would go on to explain so they don't have to ask me, well, which of course would be illegal for them to ask me, well, how are you going to do it? But I would want to make sure that they have a good foundation for hiring me. So I would say, I understand this is what the job involves. This is how I would do it. And perhaps this is how I did it in the past with
Yeah.
great success.
I think that makes a really good point there, Gene. We oftentimes advise the people that we work with that have disabilities to come to the table with a solution, come to the table with some kind of idea of how they're going to be successful. And how have you been received, Gene?
Very well. Yeah. Because I think that sets the prospective employer at ease. Because those questions, you know that's got to be going on in their head. So when it gets answered up front, that makes their job easier.
Absolutely. So my sister likes to say that I have a bit of a Pollyanna world outlook, but I really do because I feel like it's productive. And most people that you meet that are recruiters, that are hiring managers, most people that you meet out there want to help, are good people that are understanding. Perhaps some of them have slightly backwards or dated views on disabilities or inclusion in general, for that matter. But most people are good people that want to help. So the more that you can come, like Gene was saying, with a solution in mind, the more that you're going to be successful as an individual person with a disability. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, any other comments or questions that people have? I appreciate y'all staying on the call this long.
Oh, Miles, one more thing.
Yeah.
You might want to take a look at my new book, Awesome by Accident. You can find it on Amazon and major retailers everywhere. It's got all 5-star reviews. So Awesome by Accident by Gene Rogers. It's
Good.
about the past 50 years of my life as a quadriplegic.
And Gina may interview you for an upcoming YouTube video or two that I have, if you're okay with that.
I'm incredibly shy, Miles, but
Oh boy, okay.
yeah.
All right. Well, thanks, Gina. And I'll, at the very least, I'll send you a LinkedIn request. Any other questions from folks that are on the call right now? All righty. Well, let me go ahead and advance to the next slide, if you wouldn't mind, David. Alrighty, so just for you that are dropping in as well, here are some additional resources that are available for you. The first one that I would point out to is Disability In. Disability In, we're actually recruiting here locally for the Disability In Central Texas chapter to find more businesses that are passionate about hiring people with disabilities or just have questions about doing so. If you are with a Fortune 500 or 1000 company, they also have a national level involvement that you can do as well. So if you want to get involved locally or nationally, they've got options for you. Similar to that is the National Organization on Disability, which will allow you to take basically a self-assessment to see, hey, how inclusive am I as an organization around hiring people with disabilities? And it really is um, a bit of a deep dive into thinking about things really, really hard and thinking about, hey, how are my things set up? And then the final thing that I point out to as well is the Job Seekers Accommodation Network, or JAN. This is my go-to resource if I ever need to do research on an individual disability and specifically what kinds of accommodations a person may need in order to be successful in the workplace. Next slide, please. So I certainly hope you'll join me here at Peak. We're changing the world one job at a time, and we can't do it. We can't do it alone. We got to have your help. So thanks so much for your attendance, everybody. Again, feel free to connect with me. My name is Myles Wallace, and have a great rest of your day.